What up, everyone? This is Phillip Lew. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to silence your mind. We're going to watch a video titled For When You Think Too Much by Alan Watts. Alan Watts is a great 20th century philosopher, spiritual teacher, guide. And this is the first time that I am going to see this video. As always, I'll be reacting in real time with you. We are going to start with section 1, where he gets into the problem of life. And we're just going to jump into it. And I'll do my best to help make this teaching as accessible and as powerful for you so that you can get everything you want out of life.
There is no problem of life in the sense in which we ordinarily use that phrase. And that seems an almost astounding affront to our common sense. Life not a problem. We see it as nothing but problems. We regard ourselves in a morning, noon, and night struggle to solve the great problem of existence. And for some people this problem is, why does the universe exist? For other people the problem is, how am I going to get enough to eat? And therefore, when you take it at one extreme or the other, who can say that life is not a problem? And yet here is this audacious suggestion that what we are bothering about is a ghost. It's something that isn't really there. One of the characteristics of neurotic behavior, is it's repetitive. The neurotic personality keeps going through unsuccessful life patterns again and again and again, and nothing seems to be able to stop it. The round, or the rat race of birth and death, that is to say, of life as we ordinarily live it. Because it is a round, it is a vicious circle, for the reason that we keep trying to solve problems that are not simply overwhelmingly difficult, but problems that are not problems at all. They only look like problems. And so when we tackle, impossible questions, things go round and never come out. Now, take for example some of the many ghosts which haunt our minds.
All right, so right out of the gate, my reaction to this is it's absolutely correct and it's absolutely brilliant. However, a few things that I'm going to teach you right now to hopefully help this really make sense at the deepest of levels. Because when someone says, like if I were to say to you, for example, that your life has no problems, you have no problems in your life, right? That is either number one, it's going to sound, maybe for some of you who are very advanced, enlightened beings, you're like, yeah, I totally get that, Philip. I have no problems, right? For the vast majority of us, though, that may even sound offensive, right? At the very least, nonsensical. And at the very worst, it could be offensive and aggravating for someone to tell you, you have no problems. When you're right now, you could be facing any of the millions of challenges facing all of us on this planet, right? Whether it could be maybe you're unemployed, maybe you're overweight, maybe you're struggling with a drug addiction, maybe you're in a unhealthy relationship with a partner that is abusing you. Maybe you have issues with something going on in your, with your friendships, right? You could be mourning the death of a loved one. There's so many things that can create problems in our life. And so, who is Alan Watts to sit here and tell you that you have no problems in life? And who am I to sit here and agree with him and to tell you that you have no problems in life, right? So in order to understand why that statement is true, we first have to understand what is the origin of all problems in life. What is the origin? If I were to say to you, what is the first cause behind all your belief and problems in life, what would be your answer? Because the answer to that question is it is the mind that creates all problems. For example, in order for me to have a problem, for me to say I'm struggling right now because of X, Y, Z, right? That requires a thought. It requires a perception of difficulty to be expressed through the thinking, perceiving mind. But when you are in a state of enlightenment, in other words, a state where you have transcended the mind and you only know yourself as a witnessing consciousness, as a pure presence of awareness, that thought form cannot enter into your existence. You cannot declare, I have a problem, because the self, the person who's making that statement that I have a problem, I, Phillip Lew, have a problem, that Phillip Lew who's making that declaration of the existence of a problem does not exist when you're in a state of enlightenment. And without the person in existence, there are no problems. In other words, you need to be identified as a egoic mind, as an individual, in order to therefore be able to experience the suffering that comes from that particular person you're identified with believing themselves to have a problem. And likewise, when you are identified as the awareness, the pure silence of consciousness, out of that silence, the ability to experience a problem is impossible. You can almost think of it like when water is in a solid state of ice, we can think of that as the egoic mind. And you could think of problems only existing when they're in a state of ice, the egoic mind. But as you dissolve the egoic mind and the ice melts and it transforms into steam or pure consciousness, that steam cannot exist. It cannot experience the problem of ice because it's no longer ice, right? It's been transformed into a composition that is no longer even capable of comprehending the nature of problems. So this is what's meant by you have no problems. Now you might be saying, wait a second. Like, first off, even if you are enlightened and you are identified as pure consciousness, a part of you still has to be a person, right? You're the person and you're the awareness, which is one of the things I teach. So of course, you're going to be walking around in life and there's going to be challenges. And to sit here and say, oh, I'm this perfectly enlightened being and therefore problems don't exist sounds stupid. It sounds stupid to say something like that, right? Like if you're really honest with yourself, forget about spiritual gurus, forget about all these people, forget about me. Just check your own intuition. It sounds stupid to say that, right? Like, okay, I'll be enlightened, so I'll just walk around and just ignore my problems and act like they don't exist when I know they do, right? That doesn't sound very enlightened either, right? So there is a greater level of nuance to this understanding that there are no problems, because indeed problems can exist in life, right? Challenges, right? If you need to get to work, but you don't have enough money to put gas in your vehicle, that's a problem, right? And yes, you can be identified as the awareness of the one who doesn't have gas, right? But it doesn't change the fact that you don't have gas, right? And so essentially, the nuance is that when you awaken into higher consciousness, as you pursue spiritual enlightenment, what dawns upon you is that problems, right? The underlying essence of the problem, not having gas in the car or being unemployed or just having challenges in your life, whatever they are, right? Those things exist, but they don't have to create suffering. Because suffering is a result of the neurotic nature of the egoic mind that causes you to focus over and over and over again on the same fucking problems every single day, right? And you know when you're focusing on your problems, how do you know? Because you feel bad. Your emotions are an indication of whether you're aligned with your higher consciousness as pure awareness, or if you're aligned with your egoic mind. which creates suffering. So if I, for example, let's just say, we could take anything, right? Let's just say you're a small business owner. Maybe you lost your biggest client, okay? Yes, that's a problem. But you recognize the fact that you lost your client. You make a decision, well, here's what I need to do. I need to get more clients. I need to start another business, or I need to do whatever, right? You sit down, you figure out what you need to do next. Once you've figured out what you need to do next, does it make sense to keep thinking about that problem, right? Because when you keep thinking about the problem, it doesn't actually help you solve it. And in fact, what happens is you just end up feeling incrementally worse and worse and worse. And then you're just gravitating through this law of attraction, more situations likened to that, which actually makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy. The catastrophic thinking creates an atmosphere around you, your electromagnetic vibration, that then pulls into your holographic reality, into your third dimension of space and time, more situations that are likened to that problem. But in a state of enlightenment, you recognize, yes, I have this problem. I'm going to solve it by taking X, Y, Z. And then you just stop thinking about it, right? You're just in pure silence. You're free of the problem. Or to be more nuanced, you're free from the suffering that problem creates. So perhaps we could say, as we reflect on the teachings of Alan Watts, that it is in fact incorrect to state that problems don't exist. What would be more correct to say is that problems exist, but that doesn't mean that suffering has to exist as a result of those problems, right? Once you experience a challenge in your life, you can acknowledge it. You don't have to, do this like la 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 la, positive thinking, la la la, I'm just gonna forget about it. No, that's not what this teaching is. It's once you have a challenge problem in your life, you can acknowledge it, you can recognize it. In fact, you need to do that. And then you need to make concrete decision steps and actions of what you need to do. And then once you've made that decision, then you never should think about it again, and focus your mind on positive states. What would it feel like if that problem was solved? What would it feel like if you already had the solution to that problem? And then you take the necessary action steps. And if those action steps fail, then you can think about the problem again. Okay, why did my actions fail? What do I need to do differently? And then let me take those new action steps, and then you forget about it again. You go back into your positivity. This is how you create resilience in your life and how you can make life work for you. So, very, very powerful teaching.
We say, for example, that we all have an instinct to survive. And a lot of people thus treat the problem of life as, how am I to survive? And one might almost be a little cautious about relieving people of this problem, lest they should lose the impetus to go on doing their work. But that also, impetus to go on doing your work, is another ghost. We think we are driven, you see. We think that what we do has these mysterious things behind it. See, it's very important simply to keep your eye on what is being done and to describe that. And if you describe it clearly enough and well enough, you will probably find that the ghost of instinct disappeared. Thus, you see, when we talk about an instinct for survival, what is this saying? What is the evidence for the fact that there is an instinct for survival? There is no evidence except that, in fact, people survive until they don't. And this is rather odd, because what happens to the instinct for survival when people don't survive? So, in this way, we find that when we try to explain some kind of behavior, some kind of activity, by supposing that there is a motivating force, a sort of incarnate spook behind the whole thing. What has really happened is that we haven't described what's going on sufficiently clearly. Now this comes out in another way. When we try to describe anything at all and think that we are describing something that, as it were, exists all by itself. As I've often said, we are so bugged by the notion of stuff, you see, stuff acting, stuff doing things. But all that is, you see, is that the world strikes us as being material until we examine it closely. In other words, a distant nebula in the heavens looks like a solid star until you turn a giant telescope on it and you make out the clear pattern of a spiral nebula. In other words, the concept of stuff is a sensation that we get when we haven't examined things sufficiently closely, or when our instruments are not fine enough to penetrate what we're observing. But when the instruments are fine enough, what we get instead is pattern, and pattern is simply a form of behavior, of activity. Consider this in another way. Let's go back to the human organism and ask the question, well, what about its shape? How is it that a human organism is contained? All the organs are kept in by the skin. Well, we will describe, of course, the structure of skin and how it is that it holds together. But then we'll soon find out that we're also talking about the surrounding air, which impinges upon the human skin with a pressure of about 15 pounds per square inch, so that if it weren't there, we'd explode. Now, so the question arises, what is keeping the organism in shape? And we find out that it is not only what is going on inside the skin that keeps it in shape, but also what's going on outside the skin. And when we go on to describe this still more carefully, we discover that it isn't quite correct to say that it is the air that is doing this, or that it is the organism that is doing this. We begin to describe instead what Dewey and Bentley, in their very fascinating book, Knowing and the Known, call a transaction. Now that is to say, a buyer can't buy unless somebody is also selling. You can't know anything unless there's something to know. And this fact, you see, is constantly overlooked, that anything in the world, whether it's inanimate or animate, whatever it may be, is there by virtue of being in a transactional relationship, not with something else, but with everything else. A human being, of course, has ever so many relationships. They're very complicated. A person, say, we call a doctor, is not only related to his actual work of doctoring, but he may be also a father related to a family. He's a citizen related to a community in other ways than as the doctor, and so on and so forth. And so we begin to imagine him, as it were, apart from his relationships, as a sort of constant, going through all these different relationships, and therefore in some way different from them all. But this, you see, creates a ghost. It creates a being independent of all the different relationships in which he finds himself, when, as strictly speaking, he is inseparable from those relationships, and we can't.
So I'm going to provide a little bit of context here, because I understand what Alan Watts is trying to do here, but I think there's a possibility that it might be just very deep, and it may be a little difficult to understand what he's actually saying. So when he says, for example, everything exists in relationship to everything else, right? There is the knower, and then there's the known. There's the buyer, and there's the seller. There's the learner, and then there's that which can be learned, right? Like, why is he even talking about this? And what does that have to do with what he talked about in the beginning of the video, which is problems don't exist, right? Because obviously he must be talking about this for a reason, because the guy is brilliant. So what I think is going on here, and I can only speculate, but we need to first understand this notion of duality. And this is actually quite perfect, because this will help you understand the idea of what's called non-duality, or unity consciousness, or wholeness, or transcendence, right? So duality is this. How do you know if something is cold, right? How do you know if something is cold? And the answer is that you understand the concept of cold through its relationship to its opposite of hot, right? How do you know if something is dark? You understand the concept of darkness through its relationship to its polar opposite, which is hot, right? How do you understand the concept of being a buyer? Through understanding it in relationship to its polar opposite, which is a seller. If you look around in this world of space and time, what you see is that everything can only be understood through its relationship to everything else, right? We understand the concept of friendship as a result of every other friendship that we've seen throughout our life on Earth. The way the human mind works, this egoic mind, this mind of space and time, is that this mind can only create knowledge through its relationship to other either opposite or related ideas. And this is what is meant by duality, right? Everything is based on opposites. The mind can't create an idea of cold without also having the idea of hot. And this is what creates suffering on the deepest levels. This, like what he's talking about here, is so deep. Because, for example, if you want to be happy, right? The reason why you understand the concept of happiness is because you understand the concept of sadness, right? This is we're starting to create a paradox here. You can understand the concept of love because you understand the concept of hate. And so what happens with the egoic mind is every single time it or you choose happiness, you're also choosing sadness. What? Because when you choose happiness, you're actually on a very subtle level resisting or choosing the opposite of sadness, right? Happiness cannot exist without sadness when happiness is grounded or selected from the perspective of your egoic mind. When you as a person want happiness, you're also wanting sadness, because happiness as a construct, as a concept that can be comprehended, must include sadness. For without sadness, happiness cannot be understood. So if you want to experience true happiness, the only true happiness comes from beyond duality. or what we could call non-duality. And this is what many of the great spiritual teachers may have taught, and what you may have heard before, but maybe didn't quite have a full and complete and comprehensive understanding, which is this idea of a peace that passes all understanding, a love from beyond this world. What the hell are we even talking about with those kinds of notions? What essentially we're saying is that when you choose to love as the egoic mind, as a person, that I love as a person, you're also inviting the opposite of love into your existence. For love cannot exist without hate, as understood as a concept coming from the egoic mind. But when you choose to simply rest in your higher consciousness, in the pure being of your bliss, now you are expressing a love from beyond this world. And what I mean from beyond this world is I mean a love that is transcendent in nature, a love from beyond the world of space and time, a love that goes beyond the duality of life, a love that cannot be understood as a concept, but can be directly experienced as the rapturous ecstasy of your own liberated state of transcendent, higher dimensional, silent, pure awareness. And when you rest in that, and there's been many words for it, many phrases: transcendence, enlightenment, unity consciousness, non-duality, Christ consciousness. You go down the list. Whatever you want to call it, those are just concepts pointing to something beyond all concepts. And that love we could call the love of God, the love of our pure being, a love from beyond this dimension. When you choose to live your life from that place, well, now you are experiencing a love that is beyond love, a love that has no opposite, a love that doesn't bring in the polar opposite. And so I think what Alan Watts is trying to do here with us, in his own way, is he's trying to help us understand that everything in this world of space and time can only be understood through its opposites and through its relationships with everything else. To point us towards the idea that there is an interconnectedness in the whole universe, and that by transcending duality and entering into a state of non-duality or unity consciousness, then we can experience a love beyond love, a peace beyond peace, a happiness beyond happiness. And there's really one word that I would use to describe that kind of emotion. And again, this word is a concept, so don't get attached to the concept of it. But the word that I would use that would point to that which is beyond the word is bliss, the pure bliss of your being. And in that bliss, there are no problems because you're beyond duality, right? A problem can't exist unless you have the concept of a solution. Solutions help you understand what is meant by the word problem. So without problems, there's no solutions. No solutions, no problems in higher consciousness. There's just bliss. And in that bliss, there's no suffering. Okay? I know that might be super deep, a little difficult to understand. Maybe I'll do another video where I talk a little bit more about these ideas of, like, what do you mean happiness invites sadness? It requires a few other teaching points of teaching. And I think we can do another video on that later. But I think this is what Alan Watts is ultimately pointing towards.
Eliminate them. We can only describe him fully as the entire whole complex. So that, in other words, every organism could be called the behavior of the field or environment in which it is found. Now, this doesn't mean that the organism is something pushed around by the environment and is completely passive and inert, and that everything that it does is simply a response to external stimulus. Because in a way, the organism is part of its environment. After all, it is an object, a process in nature, in the cosmos, just as much as everything in its environment. There is really no way of separating the two. Instead of speaking, as it were, in this terminology of doers and done-tos, attackers and victims, we simplify things considerably. Just by confining ourselves to a description of what is happening. And as we do this, we get a peculiarly clarified picture of the world, without all sorts of ghosts. And it is in this way that we also begin to be able to have some preliminary intuition or sensation of the meaning of the fact that life is not a problem. In other words, not a contest between ourselves and our environment. This conception of life turns out to be basically phony.
Man, okay, so what Alan Watts is ultimately, I believe, aiming for us to understand when he says that life is not a problem, okay, is that when we are born into this world, we're born into this belief of separation. And I think this is ultimately what he's talking about by ghosts. This idea that we're separate from everything else around us, right? So everything's a problem. Chaos, right? Think about if you were to step into the middle of Times Square or Tokyo or Paris. In that moment, and you're surrounded by the chaos of life, right? This is the ordinary state of consciousness of humanity, is that everything is just happening around us and everything is disconnected, separate, and chaotic, right? But from a place of higher consciousness, what we come to understand is that my individuality as a person and my belief in separation is a concept that can only be understood as a result of having a concept of the polar opposite, which is the world. I am a person, and what is opposite to me is the world. So just like hot can't be understood without the concept of cold, personhood or individuality cannot be understood without the concept of the world, right? But as we, and before I say what I want to say, and this concept, this basic idea of separation is what creates, for Alan Watts, this notion of survival instinct. Because the moment you're separate and disconnected from the world, then it's all about survival, right? And this is sort of the consciousness of humanity right now. We're all trying to survive in this world, pay our bills, put food on the table, make sure we have a good life for ourselves, for our parents, for our children, for our communities. Separation, survival. But what is ultimately happening there is we are experiencing the illusion of separation through duality, through concepts. And from a place of higher transcendence, or what we could call unity consciousness, non-duality, what we do is we awaken into an understanding that beyond the concept of self, there is simply the present moment, the wholeness of the present moment. And in that wholeness of the present moment, we find that the person and the world are one. That we are one with all that is, and that everything is interconnected. And when you go back to Times Square or Paris, and you go into the middle of a bustling metropolis, instead of hearing the construction, the cars, the people, the lights, the chaos, instead of seeing that as chaos, what you see it is you see it for what it is, which is an interconnected, holistic unity of experience that is both you as well as everything else. And it transforms your perception of reality from being that of a chaos into what we could call a cosmos, where chaos is based on the idea of separation, division, disconnection, and a cosmos can be understood as unity, order, and harmony. And that because we are one with all that is, our every thought, our every emotion, every moment, our state of being, what we are believing reality to be, is getting expressed into this quantum field of wholeness and is being reflected back to us through space and time. And our circumstances are a constant reminder of what we've been expressing into this quantum field, into this realm of infinite possibilities. There are no problems. There's unity, there's oneness. Problems can exist in a literal sense of you have to deal with problems, but the suffering behind the problem, which is ultimately what he's really talking about here, right? Which is very aligned with Buddha, the end, enlightenment, the end of all suffering. We get out of duality, we rest as pure consciousness, pure awareness. And as we express a love that has no opposite, a peace that has no opposite, then the only thing that can come back to us is peace and love without an opposite. And that is the highest form of greatness.